the other day, today, like when a human writes software code, we write it in a very human readable format, right? And then we take that model and we ask AI to write it in a way that like take what humans have done and like automate what humans have done. But there's like a place in the future where AI could just write zeros and ones and like output the code, like right, and it's like, but then a human won't be able to read it.
Hello and welcome to the AI Master Group podcast, featuring the people who are building the future of AI in their work today. I'm your host, Jim Griffin. I'm very lucky to have a chance to have as our guest today, Shawn Goodin, who's the Global VP of Solutions at FirstHive, Customer Data Platform. That's a platform that enables customer intelligence through advanced data and AI. Prior to FirstHive, Shawn has led marketing transformation initiatives at companies like Capgemini and Silicon Valley Bank and JPMorgan Chase, Clorox, Northwestern Mutual, SC Johnson. I probably left something out. He's an advisory board member of the Customer Data Platform Institute, CDP Institute, and one of the advisory board members of the MarTech conference as well. And many of you may have seen Shawn as a frequent keynote speaker at top conferences, and he's also garnered some very prestigious awards in the industry. Shawn, I'm so lucky to have you as a guest today. Thank you very much for joining.
Hey, I'm so glad to be here and really appreciate this, Jim.
Yeah, we just heard that you've had a very storied career and obviously at some very notable brands. I wouldn't even know where to begin to ask you. Maybe you could tell me if there were any big takeaways from any of those stints in any of those assignments that are most memorable for you.
Sure. I mean, when I think about my career, I think that you often you if you go to somebody's LinkedIn page and you sort of get this like view that somehow they had like they had it all planned out and that they sort of went from A to B to C and D, and that that was not my experience, right? Early in my career, I started out as a software engineer, and I was working at startups, right? And a lot of, I mean, it was sort of like the early dot-com boom, and we were, building web applications from the ground up before we had terms like software as a service. And I think about those days, and I think some of the major takeaways that I gained that I in the startup world was you wear a lot of hats, learn to think like an entrepreneur, um, always think about owning whatever it is you're developing, and I think I took that into my career. It was a lot of learning along the way. But when I got into the corporate world, the first job that I went into was at SC Johnson, and that was a big leap of, okay, there's thousands of people here instead of hundreds, a lot of organizational structure, and things were a lot more conservative. And I think that on that journey from SC Johnson to JP Morgan Chase, it was sort of learning that okay, the way I'm wired is to drive transformation. And you get into large organizations and they're very focused on, in some ways, status quo, right? They're like risk adverse. And so I think, as I went into these organizations with sort of an I think people use this term like intrapreneurial, right? So it's sort of like entrepreneurial, but within the organization. There were times I had people say like, "Oh, Sean's lightning in a bottle," or he's chasing the shiny ball, right? And so it's like you can get a target on your back when you're trying to drive transformation. But I think when I think about the experiences in trying to, there's sort of this huge win though when you can take a company like JPMorgan Chase with 260,000 employees, 40,000 people in IT. Like that was when I realized, wow, I've worked at a lot of tech startups, and I went to a bank to work for the biggest tech company I've ever worked for, right? And and so driving change, right? What I learned was, communication was key. Communication, being able to bring people along, help them understand a vision of where things are going in the market and how that's going to help them drive growth. And, I mean, to make this like really concrete, when I was at Chase, I was leading the marketing technology team there. Probably had about 100 and so folks on my team, and personalization at scale was sort of the like, that's sort of our North Star. Let's drive personalization. And so all of a sudden you're looking at, okay, I've got 25 million active users on chase.com. I've got massive amount of credit card transactions, banking transactions, the ultimate rewards platform. So you've got all these like rewards. Like, how do I bring all this together? How do I take all of this data, right, and drive personalization? And and what I found was on one level, being in financial services, banking is also conservative about sort of where they want to put their data. But getting the data and the technology put together, I don't want to say that was easy. I mean, it was monumental. But what I found was more difficult was you can bring AI to the table and say, hey, we can drive next best action. But inside of an organization, you have, the credit card team saying, "Well, I just want to sell credit cards. My bonus is related to how many credit cards do I get people to sign up for, or can I get people to use their credit card more?" And the mortgage team is like, "No, well, I care about this." And so you find yourself in a place where you're like, well, the technology can most likely drive what's best for JP Morgan, but we've got to change the structure inside of the organization that's highly siloed to get there. And you don't change people's bonus structures and get them aligned, right? You have to start showing them value. And so what I found very quickly was, okay, we've got technology that can do amazing things, but we almost had to sort of throttle it back and sort of hardwire weights into it to make the different business teams happy and show them slowly that they could get what they wanted, and then slowly start taking those throttles back out and saying, well, let's run an experiment here, right? And then show and then measure, right? So it was like, so that was, I think, a huge takeaway that I got when I was at Chase. And then taking that knowledge when I went to Silicon Valley Bank, right, which was a bit of a pivot because it was much more of a sort of moving from a B2C marketing to a B2B marketing space, and and hyper targeted on startups, right? So we were banking startups, and so learning, taking that, okay, let's get the data right, but I think on, when I sort of took me about a year to convince the entire organization that we should put like a customer data platform in place, not so much because people didn't want to drive personalization, but just because, again, organizational silos, getting IT, and like, is this aligning to our North Star architecture? How does this align with the chief data officer's goals? How is this aligned to the different business goals? Right? But once we got the platform in place, it was, well, there's, like historically, the data platform that we had about 400 different customer data attributes. And there was sort of this, well, let's just move it all. Let's just move it all into the customer data platform. And I said, let's not do that. Let's do some analysis on this data and say, how much of this data have we used historically to drive business value? And what we found out of those 400 data attributes was about 50 of them mattered on day one, right? And so just a lot of learning about, what you can do with technology and what you should do with technology and how you move, people along a path to that transformation has been a big part of, I think, how I've been able to be successful. And and I think in the early days, right, like I came in with this sort of entrepreneurial mindset where everybody's like, well, what's the worst thing that could happen? I mean, our company's not even successful yet. Just try everything, right? Like that's sort of like the early days of a startup to, one of the biggest bank in the United States is not, does not want to just test and try, anything and everything out. And so I think those were some of the ways that I was able to take some of the early sort of entrepreneurial that sort of became digital transformation and marketing transformation, and then learn how to bring that into a corporate environment, um, and realize that you had to do a lot of communication. You had to like get business teams on board. You had to measure and test and measure and test and optimize your way, right? And it might take 2 years to get to where your vision is, but if you're patient, you can actually get there and drive a lot of change and a lot of value. Yeah.
Yeah, that's very interesting. So, what I liked about that story was the really two ends of the spectrum, the entrepreneurial side with the startups, very small teams, just try it all the way through to the very realistic. I've seen myself too, where different stakeholders just want their own particular thing to get pushed out to consumers, and they don't care about the other ones because they're not bonused on the other things. And you have to try to manage what's best for the company. That's not easy. So now you've made a move pretty recently. Can you tell me about that? You're now at FirstHive. That was a pretty big move.
Yeah, it was definitely, I think, I mean, on the personal side, I think a little bit of sort of as I think about my career trajectory, you're in startups and then you start building a family, you start having children, and you start getting to this place where, I've been in multiple startups that had seed funding and didn't get to like round A's, and you kind of get that call one day that's like, hey, that check you got last week, it's the second to last one you're gonna get. Right? And so the move into the corporate world, I think, has always felt a little bit of friction for me. Like I think I've been successful, but at my heart, like the startup space, the entrepreneurial space is where, I'm probably most alive, right? Like I'm definitely most energized in that space. And I'm sort of at this place in my career where, I kind of been doing the same thing for, decade and a half. But my children are all pretty much grown. And sort of life is like, I've sort of got to this place where, you know, the family dynamic is like, hey, let's go do something crazy. So, and it, and it like it, and to me, so FirstHive is a customer data platform that has been around for close to 5 years now. And I actually met Aditya, who's the founder, when I was at Silicon Valley Bank about 4 years ago, because one of the early investors of FirstHive was on the board at Silicon Valley Bank, and he had multiple MarTech vendors in his portfolio, and he asked me if they could come pitch. And so I got to know Aditya, and there were some things that really stood out to me. I think in my intro we kind of mentioned that I've been on the Customer Data Platform Institute advisory board since it started 7 or 8 years ago, and I've sort of been at the like as I've been I've I guess what I would say is I've seen a lot of the CDPs that are out there. Like, I mean, I have talked to, like, I know a lot of the founders of some of these CDPs, and and their data model really stood out to me, and the way that he talked about where this was going, right? From a, I think there's a future of today. Somebody goes into a customer data platform, they've got a marketing strategy. It's very specific. Like, hey, I need to run an email campaign. They go in, they find an audience, they build their campaign, and they send it. Well, like I think there's a vision of where First Hive is going, where you come to the platform and you say, I want to grow my credit card business by 20% in the US. What should I do? Right? Like, have it help you build your strategy, have it help you build the campaign strategy, and then yes, execute. But I think we're moving into this place, and what I'm starting, sort of been working on this concept of this customer experience operating system. And so this has been a vision that I've had. I mean, if I could go back 10 years, I mean, I have decks that I've pitched 10 years ago at Clorox that talk about, the customer experience maturity model. And this maturity model sort of has three pillars: identify, engage, and measure. So you need to know your customer, you need to engage with your customer, and you need to measure. And data is the foundation under those three pillars that hold up the sort of maturity model. And the way that I think about those three things is that, so from a identify point of view, it's sort of we've gone from like mass marketing to targeted marketing, and we're moving into a realm of one-to-one marketing. From a engage, we've gone from single channel to multi-channel, and we're moving to omni-channel. And from a sort of analytics perspective, we've gone from sort of manual to automated to predictive, right? And so we have these three levers, and I think we've had a lot of the data. We're getting the data. Everybody's sort of on this journey to get more data. But how do you truly do one to one? How do you create enough content across, if your brand has 4 or 5 channels, and so that content not only needs to be personalized for that individual, but it needs to be personalized in multiple formats for multiple channels, right? And I think we're at this like precipice with generative AI, and it's still early days, but the ability to almost create content on the fly, that is becoming a reality. And so, I think, so for me, the leap to First Hive, getting back to that question, was I want to be at a company that it has data at the center, right? Customer data at the center of its ecosystem, but has a vision to transform what I would call sort of marketing operations into a way that is very sort of either AI native or AI emergent, and from my perspective, I think in the next 5 years, there's going to be three kinds of companies: AI native companies that sort of built everything from the ground up with AI at its core; AI emergent with leaders, that are visionaries and realize the transformational power of AI; and the third type of company is going to be obsolete. right? Because the ones, because they're going to be their lunch is going to be eaten, right? And so, and so, so for me, um, the beauty of the role that I have, and I'm doing a couple of things here, right? So solutions engineering. So, part of that is around pre-sales, and then, execution of the platform and making sure that our clients are actually, have successful implementations. But some of the other things that I'm working on is sort of feedback into the product teams about where this should be going, and and how to evolve the product vision, and also how do we sort of drive partnerships and expand sort of the where, like, how we go to market, and to with whom we go to market, and what other types of platforms should we where should we be building, and where should we be integrating with other platforms, and hyperscaler relationships, all of those types of things. So it's a really exciting role because I'm getting to sort of wear a lot of hats, and and have direct access to the founder, which is just been really exciting. I've been here almost 3 months now, and and I think our future is bright.
So, from a funding standpoint, where is FirstHive?
So, so we just got like I don't know if it's a technically a round A, or it's somewhere between seed and round A. The company started in India and grew from there, and but that is now headquartered in the U.S. And we got a round of funding back in February to really expand in the U.S. And so that has been, so we're building the U.S. team, the sales team, and and my role is global, so I'm supporting both the U.S. expansion and the sort of the growth on in India and Asia. So
Oh, okay, that's very interesting. You know, you've talked about a lot of things and you've talked about your career and your most recent, but I think if I recall when we spoke before that your interest in AI actually transcends technology itself, including really fundamental questions about even things like cognitive science. I think going all the way back to your anthropology studies. Do I remember that correctly?
yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, I think AI for me sort of evolved out of, so I mean like I think I said early on, like, there has not been this clear path, right? When I first went to college, I was a music major. I actually got into UCLA in their ethnomusicology program, and I was playing Latin percussion. And so, but what I found, a little humbling statement for me was, you get into a program like that, and all of a sudden, you're surrounded by these amazing artists and creative folks, and I realized there are certain things that you're extremely passionate about, but maybe you're not that good at, and those things are called hobbies, right?
You're listening to the AI Master Group podcast.
And I realized there are certain things that you're extremely passionate about, but maybe you're not that good at, and those things are called hobbies, right? And so after I spent about a quarter at UCLA, and it was this ethnomusic. So I had been studying anthropology and music, and so ethnomusic, sort of how music comes to life in culture. And so I pivoted and I moved into the anthropology department, and then that sort of moved me into this interesting space between sort of cultural anthropology and physical anthropology, where, well, we all have this, evolutionary biology, that, and yet we have all these very diverse cultures. And so, how do these two things interact? And it got me into cognitive science. The funny story was I found myself in this like neurophysiology class at UCLA that I did not belong in, but I was like, I need to understand this on a deeper level. And it was one of the few classes that I just like got through, right? I was like, all right, I got a C. I mean, I was like a really good student, but like that one challenged me. But what it did was it got me thinking about like sort of the mind and cognitive science and how does the structure of the mind and then the world views that come out of that, how does all of this sort of work? And it took me down some interesting, in Latin America, cultures taking hallucinogens and creating and telling mythic stories and like really interesting stuff. So I wrote my honors thesis in that space. But it also sort of, as I evolved from there, and then I got into computer science because I went back to school and got a master's degree in information technology. Like that then took me into this computer science space. And I remember I read this book. It was called On Intelligence. I think Jeff Hawkins, and he was sort of in that space of talking about sort of like where AI is going and that we should be mapping this back to sort of how the human brain works, and that wasn't exactly how like if you look at like the early years of like sort of the data science, yes, it was sort of based loosely on our understanding of the brain, but our understanding of the brain in the 50s has evolved a lot, right? But the models that we're using in AI haven't really evolved with sort of the evolution of what we know about the brain today. And so so anyway, that was sort of what brought me in, and I've always been sort of trying to understand this, like the biological side of the brain, and then how computer science and AI is evolving, and I think we're seeing some of this with, I think that if you follow some of the leading researchers out there, and the guy that comes to mind is like Jan LeCun at Meta, who's saying, the transformer architecture is not going to get us to AGI, right? It's like large language models are fooling us all. Like they sound intelligent, but as soon as you start asking them to reason, they don't have a context for reasoning and they don't have a worldview. And when you think about the human condition, like we consume a lot of information in the first 4 years of our lives through vision, through movement, right? And so I'm seeing a lot of, like it's not that large language models aren't going to be a part of sort of how we get to AGI, but this sense of embodying agents in AI. Also seeing this from like Jim Fan at NVIDIA, who did this whole project where he took AI and gave it access to Minecraft. And so it gave it a three-dimensional world, and sort of said, go figure out how to build skills and figure out how to like maneuver in this world. And so I think there's a lot going on in AI that, sort of that evolution of like how do we get to AGI, that just it just intrigues me and sort of brings all of this stuff back together for me. And then I think the other piece is the sort of like bias side of AI, and I have in my personal world, like studying anthropology like definitely makes me very aware of different worldviews and different cultural views, and how bias can be embedded in things and how we have to be hypersensitive to that. And then I also I've done a lot of volunteering in like inner city with the urban poor in LA and in the Bay Area. And I also adopted African American children through the foster care system. So all of these things wrap up for me into like we've got to be having really hard conversations around where like where is AGI going, and all the excitement and all the amazing things that can happen and all of the things that we have to like figure out how to manage in that conversation, right? And so so anyway, I find myself pulling on a lot of different threads and trying to bring all that back together into a conversation that we can have about sort of, where is AGI, and do we think we're going to get there in the next couple of years, and how excited and how fearful should we be all at the same time?
So, what I find interesting about your story is this all of these threads. You've got the thread of the education, your personal experience, the corporate, both on the entrepreneurial side and the large side. That I wonder where you see all this heading next. What are going to be, probably as you look back on the next 2 years, what are probably going to be the things that are most likely to cause you satisfaction or contentment with the things that you're doing today?
Yeah, I mean, I think for me, when I look at, there's sort of a handful of things as you sort of look at the future of where AI and technology are going, that as you see them convert, well, and I think there are some other pieces in this, but I think, like the agentic frameworks that are coming out and sort of how you start to think about, building entire teams of like AI agents that work together, and the ability to give those agents tools and give them workflows, and then I think the open source world with AI is also allowing us to see. I mean, I think saw a little bit of this with the recent AI announcement from Apple, right? But being able to fine tune much smaller models that can be on device, and this idea of sort of model routing, right? Like I think that like as we get agents that and those agents can like have reinforcement learning, kind of give them play, give them tasks, and they learn tasks. Like you can give them tools, you can give them skills, but they can actually learn and create skills on their own, and then have those models be able to pick from, yes, sometimes I need, an open, a GPT 4.0. Sometimes I don't. And I can, and so you can manage speed, quality, and cost through routing to different AI models, right? I think we're going to start to see, and this is sort of like the framework that I'm sort of trying to pull together is this like customer experience operating system, because that's the space I know. Like I know how to personalize experiences. I know marketing, sales, and customer service, right? So like there's going to be millions of uses for these things, but from my perspective, building a native AI sort of customer experience operating system that starts to bring this together, is sort of the vision of what I want to see the evolution of marketing automation. I think the thing that's interesting about it, though, that we have to start having some hard conversations about is, well, how is this going to impact people's jobs, right? Like as you build these agents, right? How is it going? And not just like not so like I don't want to leap into like, oh, people won't have jobs. It's that the work and the tasks that they do today, as many of those things can get hyper automated. What is the work that they could be doing, and how does AI also sort of be a co-pilot to helping them accelerate and drive efficiency in that work? But what do the organizational models look like? I mean, I seriously yesterday saw a post from a company called Lattice who said they're putting digital agents into their HR org model, right? Like so like in the future, will we name these agents and give them, like, just like when we go into, like, when you go into a corporate job and it's like your goals for this year are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Will we give agents goals, and will we give them, sort of, and will they report, and will there be tech lead agents that have other agents reporting to them, and are there humans embedded in these teams? Are there going to be agents and humans working in collaboration in teams? I think that reality is coming, and and I think that a lot of folks are sort of like, they like, I don't want to talk about people losing jobs, or I don't want to talk, they don't want to have some of these hard conversations. And I think we're going to have those conversations for organizations to do the change management, the communication, and sort of, and rethink how some of these tools work, right? Because I mean, I think like, I was thinking about this the other day, today, like, when a human writes software code, we write it in a very human readable format, right? And then we take that model and we ask AI to write it in a way that, like, take what humans have done and, like, automate what humans have done. But there's, like, a place in the future where AI could just write zeros and ones and like output the code, like, right, and it's like, but then a human won't be able to read it, right? And so where does that go, and how do we keep transparency on sort of, where, as we get to sort of an AGI world, how do we keep human transparency at the center of this? Um, so there's a lot of things to think about, but for me, it's like, I don't think it's a question of if this is our future. It's how fast we get there and how well do we manage it.
Well, it's pretty interesting. I mean, so many different dimensions to this. And as you rightly pointed out, your area of focus primarily, because all of us have to have some area of focus in this dynamic world. Yours is specifically the customer, that whether it be through CDP or segment of one or so forth, that's the lens in which you're applying these same skills. Others are applying them in biotechnology or whatever other arenas they may also be applied. So, and you've learned a lot. In fact, you just mentioned a couple of books and authors. Are there any things that you've encountered either from books or podcasts or other sources that were particularly notable, that something that I should look into?
Yeah, I think earlier I had mentioned that Jeff Hawkins book on intelligence, and he has a really interesting story, and I won't, try to, sort of go into that whole story, but he went into academia, and then he went out and started his own organization to actually study the brain, and he's been doing a lot of research, and so he recently put out a new book called, I think it's like The Thousand Brains, and I couldn't put that book down. And and he talks a lot about sort of the research around sort of neuroscience and cognitive science, but the last couple of chapters then go back into AI, right? And how, like, for us to sort of evolve AI, what we're doing today isn't going to get us to, like, being able to actually create the human brain. And and there's some I mean, he even makes some points in there sort of about, well, maybe all of the fight or flight part of the human brain, like the limbic system and the lizard brain, as I've heard people call it, like, maybe we don't want AI to have that. you know and maybe it should only, but maybe we should be focused on the frontal cortex. But it's really intriguing to me, like, so that. I think that's a really interesting book to read. When I go back and I think about, so like one of the books that really got me excited as well was this book, Automate This. Um, I'm forgetting the name, but there was a really interesting story in there about a professor at UC Santa Cruz, and I think kind of tied back to my music background, using AI to create music. I think his name was Christopher Dole, Professor Christopher Dole. Um, and he had some really interesting, like he actually trained models. I mean, and this was like that book came out, I think, in like 2012 or something. So this was way before, sort of the world we're in today with some of the generative AI pieces. And he had actually trained it to create like Bach-like music, and people were very upset about it at the time. And like this, you can't, technology can't create be as creative and create as, and so he actually put out some CDs where he was like, here's stuff, some of the music on this CD was created by AI and some of it wasn't. Can you tell me which one is which? Right? And he actually did something like that with it writing poetry as well, and put out a book of poetry, and some of it was human generated and some of it was AI generated. And so, I think, like that really sort of intrigued me in the sort of art of the possible, right? And I think that that's one of the things, like, always been curious. And I think, it's sort of that story about the like 4 minute mile. Like, you don't believe, like, until somebody ran the 4 minute mile, people didn't believe it was possible. And I actually made a post on LinkedIn yesterday. I found this video that I created when GPT-4 first came out with Vision. And I took a slide that I had created about how AI can be used in marketing. I uploaded that slide to GPT-4 and said, write a script about this slide, right? That you could like demoing this slide. It wrote the script. I didn't edit it at all. I then took that to 11 Labs, created an audio file of that script, being brought to life with a voice. And then I took the static image, that audio file, and made a video out of it. And like you can go to my LinkedIn page and you can actually see that. And like I didn't edit it. I didn't edit it at all. And it's like I a year and a half ago I wouldn't believed that an AI technology could do what it did. Right? Like I mean the depth in which it was able to just take a picture and actually talk about that picture in detail is, and so now I think for me, like the beauty of that is like, okay, the 4 minute mile for me has been broken, and so I'm dreaming a lot bigger, right? Like the models that we have today are the worst models we're ever going to have, right? And it's like when GPT-5 comes out, we're all going to be blown away again. And then what? And then like humans we get blown away, and then very quickly we're like, yeah, it's not that good, right? And it's like, but over the next 2 years, I think we are going to start to see technology that we really were only real in sci-fi movies, right? And so we're going to have to rethink, like we're going to get to rethink how we run businesses, how we build technology, and how we serve humanity with this technology. So my recommendation for people is pick something that you're interested in and go deep there.
Well, this has been very interesting. I mean, we've covered so many different things and the suggestions at the very end. One of the things that you just mentioned was a post that was on LinkedIn that you just posted, and I'm going to go look at that right after this recording. But it reminded me to ask you, how is it that people can get in touch with you? What channels are the best way if they want to follow up from this?
So I mean, if people want to email me, I'm at Shawn.Goodin@FirstHive.com. Please reach out to me, especially if you want to learn more about sort of what I'm doing there around, customer data platforms. On Twitter X, it's at Shawn Goodin. LinkedIn, I'm at, sort of in slash Sean David Goodin. So those are all places to find me. And I think, you know, LinkedIn is probably one of the places that I'm most active. Um, but, uh, but yeah,
All right. Well, are there any final words that you want to share with us as we wrap up this very interesting conversation?
I'm just such a big, huge proponent of open source. Like there's a lot of stuff out there right now that, I mean, there's law, policies in California right now that feel like they're trying to shut some of this down, and we cannot have that happen. Like we cannot have four companies managing the future of where AI is going. Like this has to be grassroots, and we have researchers need access to these tools.
Yeah, that could be a whole nother conversation right there. Well, Shawn, this has been fantastic. Thank you so much. I'm so happy. I learned a lot today, and I know our listeners did as well. So thank you very much, and I hope to talk to you again very soon.
Absolutely, Jim. Have a great day.
You've been listening to the AI Master Group Podcast. I'm your host, Jim Griffin. Until next time, stay curious and stay in front.